Afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Neve. I'm one of the 4 commissioners with the Ottawa People's Commission on the Convoy Occupation. My colleague Munya Mazig, who's with me, will introduce herself in a moment. Our 2 other colleagues, Leilani Farha and Debbie Awusu-Achia, are not here this afternoon. We tend to mix it up a bit, but have certainly been very engaged in many other sessions. I want to begin by acknowledging that we do come together for this important session this afternoon on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, which is always important to recognize and show our respect for. But we've been very cognizant of the fact that it's in many respects even more acutely important that we begin with that recognition, given that we're talking about occupation of these lands. Occupation of these lands that no occupation that goes back many, many years, of course, but a very fraught and difficult and traumatic experience of occupation of these lands in February of this year. And so that grounding is something that we're keeping very much in mind as we proceed throughout the Commission. And it, in turn, connects with what is really our guiding framework, our foundation to everything we're doing through the Commission process, and that is to recognize that at the end of the day, this is all about human rights. I think we all recognize, appreciate, and I'm sure are fierce champions of the right to protest, the right to peaceful protest. Many of us probably couldn't even count the number of times we've exercised that right. A lot of you were probably out on Friday exercising that right in solidarity with education workers. And we will be moving through the Commission process very cognizant of how important that right is. At the same time, we bring to this process a very important understanding that there's a whole other human rights framework that applies here, and that is the range of human rights, all human rights, that adhere to members of this community, to the people who live in this community, to the people who work in this community, even to the people who just regularly pass through this community. Rights around housing and health care and well-being, safety and security, the rights to be free of racism and discrimination, and many other fundamental human rights. And certainly, as we've now had quite a number of sessions, both in person and online, and have heard from many people, it's become very clear to us that those, to put it mildly, those rights were very vulnerable during the occupation process, and more to the point, were violated, abused, really at every turn, every day. The People's Commission itself is a key element of this community's, and it's powerful that we are sort of within the community today for this session, this community's response to the disruption of last winter's convoy occupation, which of course we know affected so many local residents and businesses. And our goal, it's both very simple, but also profoundly important, is to be a venue for both healing and for justice. And doing so by way of hearing the stories from those who were impacted most, and looking at the response of governments through the eyes of community members, with a view to making recommendations, at the end of the day, really, very importantly aimed at hopefully avoiding something like this happening again in this way. Many of you may feel, I think after the week that was, that this is perhaps an even more obviously important process if you have been following the Public Order Emergency Commission, Justice Rouleau's inquiry, which of course this week has been taken up predominantly with testimony and cross-examination from a significant, quite a staggering number of convoy organizers and leaders. And I think amongst other things, that's for many people put into perspective how much of an imbalance that official process offers in terms of where's anything close to an equivalent space for the community to share its view and its perspective. There was some profoundly important testimony at the very beginning on day one, which already seems a lifetime ago in that inquiry, and then nothing since, and as things stand now, there will not be any further community-level testimony at that inquiry. So all the more reason why this process becomes so important. This is the third time that we've held an in-person set of hearings since we began our process in late September. We've also been holding a number of sessions online, and we've also had a series of what we've been calling community meetings, which is not so much hearing individually from people, but gathering as a group with a particular community, a particularly impacted community, and having a conversation that way. Today, we are going to hear from 5 local residents who have registered to appear. Each is going to offer some opening remarks in the range of about 5 minutes long, and then Monia and I will have some questions, and then we'll move on. The Commission we are leaving it to people to decide to what extent they want to identify themselves, give their name, their full name, their first name, an alias, no name at all. That is in their hands, and I think you would all appreciate why that's important, given how polarized, and I think many would say toxic, the wider context and climate has become around these issues. But I will assure you that Commission staff and volunteers have fully verified the identity of everyone who is registered to speak. So even if they don't identify themselves publicly, we have verified who they are. Our session today is public, and I understand that we do have some media in the room today. But media also have been asked to respect and protect the identity of those appearing before us, consistent with their wishes, and I know that will be the case. We want this very much to be an open, welcoming, and safe space, and we have worked throughout these last 3 months to make sure that's the case. That's why we have asked everyone today to wear a mask, and I look out and see a sea of you doing so. Speakers, like I am right now, do have the option to remove their mask while they're speaking, however. We also want to ensure that this is a respectful exchange, and we will not at all permit offensive, hateful, or violent language. Anyone who uses offensive language or is disruptive will be asked to leave. And I'm not saying that directed at the 5 people who are speaking today. We have said that at the beginning of every session. We do recognize that these are difficult topics, brings back difficult memories for some people, can be triggering and re-traumatizing. And wanted to let you know that anyone who is feeling distress, we totally understand if you feel the need to step away from the session and go out into the corridor to reduce that stress. We also do have counseling resources that are available, so please feel free to ask about that at the registration desk if you feel you need that. Lastly, as Gael said earlier, our session is being interpreted into French and English, so I just wanted to remind in particular our 5 presenters, but it's always a good reminder for Monia and I as well, to speak clearly so that the interpreters, wonderful as they are, can do their job. I'm now going to give Monia a brief opportunity to introduce herself, and then I will welcome up the first speaker.
Thank you, Alex, for this very good introduction. My name is Monia Mazig. I am a resident of Ottawa. I am an author, and I am also a human rights activist. And I feel that I am very privileged to be one of the commissioners conducting this work, hearing from the community, and later on redacting or actually writing a report about what we have heard and about eventually recommendation that we would like to share, first of all, with the community itself, because this is a grassroots initiative. It came from the community, and the main objective is also to find these recommendations and share them with the community. But also, I think we would love to share those recommendations with all levels of government, with the police, with whoever we consider as either decision maker or legislator who have the power to make things better. And so, like Alex said, so this would not repeat again in our city. So I'm not going to say more than this. I think Alex covered everything. And I would love to welcome the first speaker to the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll be reading my statement. Good afternoon, Commissioners, and thank you very much for the opportunity to offer my perspective on the occupation of Ottawa's downtown. My name is Jim Pont. My home is in Old Ottawa East, just off of Main Street, though my work is downtown. I hope to emphasize how the occupation affected a wider swath than what was called the Red Zone, with more than just big rigs on Wellington. I'm the minister at Knox Presbyterian Church on Elgin Street. During the entire pandemic, I routinely commuted by foot, including a walk up and down Elgin. Often it was a pleasant stroll during a tough time for all of us during the pandemic. For me, it was a way to collect my thoughts and try to think of things positive. As I walked, I would be reminded of how this community so much rallied together. I would reflect on how even Knox Church, where I worked, was a benefactor of generosity towards our weekly meal program for neighbors in need, which we had pivoted to an outdoor takeout format, receiving donations and volunteer support from many new partners. Pubs, retailers, and a local grocer were generous to us. And then came a protest called the Freedom Convoy, significantly disrupting this mission of our church and other inner-city faith groups or organizations, and of course, downtown residents and retailers. Like others, as was already mentioned here, I've witnessed numerous protests in Ottawa. With Knox immediately beside the Human Rights Monument, I've seen how protests often have many passionate supporters, voicing causes vigorously, mostly polite. And then they leave again to live out their convictions at home. Most of us understand this is part of life in a capital city, especially downtown. The Freedom Convoy was a very different, disorderly, divisive experience for so many. Through 4 consecutive Saturdays, the occupation severely affected our particular church's outdoor meal distribution. Many of our regularly more than 100 guests didn't show up. Volunteers couldn't travel in for reasons of anxiety or traffic restrictions. Thankfully, we had a good core of new Centertown volunteers able to fill gaps on very short notice. I also recall the following: protesters urinating against our church walls, volunteers mocked by protesters for wearing masks, our dinner guests in line harassed to take off their masks. And on February 12th, during my walk to Knox to assist our volunteers, I was verbally threatened by 3 protesters. The incident was recorded by a local resident walking past. And I'll never forget how the loudest person's unmasked face shouted directly into mine from about 4 inches away, "Get the hell out of my face." Ironic. I recall the person who recorded this pleading, "Can you please just leave our city? Don't you see what you're doing to us? Knox had planned earlier in January for a safe return to in-person gatherings for Sunday of February the 6th. And this became impossible for us too because of traffic restrictions. On one of the Saturdays of our meal program, a group of protesters became visibly angered upon seeing our church sign that stated online worship only. And one of them pointed a fist toward me, shouting, "You should obey God rather than effing Trudeau." Ironic again. How these folks were the very reason we had delayed in-person gatherings. On one of my walks home, I was pacing through an intersection with the pedestrian signal clearly on when a honking vehicle adorned with flags came within inches of myself and another local pedestrian, obviously trying to intimidate. I witnessed a similar event another night when a young woman attempted to cross a street while a pickup truck, horn blaring, edged directly toward her. The look of fear on her face is seared in my memory. Protesters were everywhere up and down Elgin, especially weekends, clearly identifiable with waving flags, placards with obscenities, and annoying shouts of freedom. Their very presence created intimidation. On occasion, I would attempt a conversation, though when becoming aware I wasn't in agreement with them, they would become hostile in tone. I'll never forget a young family walking past me. Two parents waving marked up Canadian flags with a child probably around 12, carrying a sign stating, "F Trudeau." It still baffles me how parents of young children made it all appear like a family-friendly carnival. My daily walks included passing Ottawa Police Service headquarters. Cruisers were often parked there, and I would engage in conversation if officers seemed to have time, and some of them did. They were mostly empathetic about the disruption caused to local residents and retailers. Though until the final weekend when OPS, OPP, RCMP units made a coordinated effort, their constant refrain was they didn't have adequate resources, and they could only respond in accord with directives from higher up. And it left all of us abandoned. I participated in 2 community walks hosted by councillors of Capital and Somerset wards, and I thank them for that. Conversations on these walks, though they were filled with largely peaceful residents, were intense and filled with growing anxiety and opposition toward the occupation. I took time during all this to watch some protesters' videos on YouTube, becoming increasingly convinced that at least some knew exactly what they were doing to our downtown, purposely creating anxiety, hoping for disruption and division. In some ways, they were successful. There was palpable, growing unrest and disappointment with all levels of government and policing. I recall numerous conversations with Elgin Street retailers who felt threatened, even abandoned. And to this day, I'm troubled how good people had reputations stained, lost jobs, or resigned from leadership. Well-intentioned civic leaders were caught in the crossfire trying to resolve the illegal occupation. From what I witnessed toward that final weekend, this situation was becoming increasingly intense and explosive, well outside the red zone. While there were clearly some who came to our city with genuine concern, there was an identifiable group intimidating and harassing the wider downtown. In addition to the main occupation on Wellington and surrounding area, many walked streets or drove around in vehicles, intimidating and harassing downtown residents. It wasn't just the big rigs in the red zone. I want to thank you for the opportunity to present my reflections on the occupation, how it affected me personally, the inner city church where I work, and the downtown of Ottawa, which I deeply love.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was very thoughtful and very eloquently put. And I think certainly gives rise to a number of things I'd love to explore a bit further in some questions, and I expect Monia may have some as well. So maybe I'll see first if she wanted to ask you anything, and then I'll follow up.
Yes, thank you very much. That was very, very insightful, and for sure, even for the few minutes of time, a lot of information and details. You mentioned that you have the weekly food program that you have for people around, living here. During other consultation or hearing, it came to our attention that people who lived in the zone affected by the convoy, especially what we call homeless people, they disappeared during the time of the convoy. Like some residents used to see, they have their, own kind of person that they know, familiar faces, and they have not seen them. With your experience, with your knowledge, do you know what happened to some of these folks who usually maybe some of them would come to your food program? Do you know what?
Thanks for the question, Monia. Some of them we know because they did come back to our weekly program after this. They were simply afraid. They were anxious to go outside. We know that some of them did. We also do know that some did go downtown to the convoy, where there was food there for some of them as well. But quite a few were afraid, simply anxious, and some did not even dare to go outside.
Another question I have also, so that was a disruption, and then any other program that you had to cancel because of the presence of the convoy?
Yeah, we also have a monthly music and meditation night called Jazz Vespers, and we had to cancel that as well because there simply wasn't a possibility of people coming downtown to do that safely. And of course, our Sunday morning worship services had to be canceled, which I had mentioned we had hoped to have indoor again at that time, but it just simply wasn't possible. But other than that, because of the pandemic, a lot of our other programs were already paused. But the meal program is, I always tell people from our church and our community, is really central to our mission. And so it was very, very sad that it was so deeply affected.
I am going to ask a question, and maybe if you don't want to answer, feel free not to. As a person of faith, and also as someone worked with the community, did you feel that, how did you feel? How did you feel like seeing all this disruption, all this, can you share with us?
For sure. Very conflicted, and particularly because there were people of faith, even from my own Christian faith, who were a big part of the convoy. So that made it very conflicting for me as a minister of a downtown Christian church. In my longer submission that I sent to the commission, I reflect briefly on that and how a colleague and myself were interviewed by CBC Radio about that very issue as well, and how we squared the reality that us as ministers of downtown churches speaking against the occupation, while there were people from our own faith coming from other parts of the city and other parts of the province and the country supporting it. So the best word is conflicted.
Conflicted. Thank you very much.
I had a couple of areas that I'd love to hear more about. One is that I too picked up on how important that weekly meal program obviously was. So I wanted to ask a couple of things about that. You said that on average you fed about 100 people, I think. Is that what you had said?
Yeah. It goes between 100 and sometimes 150. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had 140, so
Okay.
in that range.
But then you referred to the fact that, many were not coming. Do you have a general sense as to, are we talking about a 50% drop-off, a 75% drop-off? Nothing precise, but a general idea?
Yeah, between 1/3 and a half, I would say.
Okay. And there were numerous reports throughout February of convoy participants who themselves tried to avail themselves of things like food banks and shelters, et cetera. Did you have any of that happen at the church?
Yes, we did. And we made a conscious decision that if they were respectful and if they wore a mask and if they were in the same line, that we would give a meal to anybody. And so we know that there were some.
And so you didn't have any particular incidents of disruption related to that?
Not related to the distribution of
Right.
food.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, we've really been exploring with people to get a sense of what both their experience and I suppose also maybe their expectations were of the police, and you've certainly touched on that already. But I'm very conscious of the fact that, there you are, a church, very centrally located, including a church that's operating an important social service, working with a vulnerable population. Did the police, was there anything proactive done by the police? Did the police ever come to check in as to how things were with the church in general, I guess, but in particular to see how things were going with respect to some of the programming you were offering, make an attempt to reach out and give a sense that they were there to provide assistance if needed? Anything like that happen?
Nothing other than patrolling the area, so we would see police officers walking by the church even when we were doing the meal distribution, but not specifically reaching out to us.
Okay. And you talked about your own conversations with police when you went down to the police station, which you described as quite standoffish. Did you, I guess that's my word, but that they were feeling like there wasn't really anything they were going to do because of a lack of resources and no clear orders. Did you have a chance to talk with them about any of the kinds of things you were witnessing or experiencing?
Yes, I did. As a matter of fact, I didn't say it here, and I don't think it's in my written submission either, but on one occasion, one of those incidents when a vehicle inched right up towards myself and another pedestrian. Immediately after that, on my walk home, there were a couple of cruisers right by the station, and I told them about what had just happened. And they said, well, did you get hurt? And I said, no, I didn't get hurt, but this is what happened. But there was nothing further done or asked of me.
And
they didn't ask you to file a report or...
No, because they said, did you get hurt? And I said, no, we weren't hurt.
Right.
Yeah.
And that particular incident you described around them sort of being, ironically, being the ones who were in your face and then telling you to get out of their face. Did you find that, were you afraid during that incident? I'm wondering if any of the kinds of encounters you had, I mean, obviously they're upsetting to have that kind of verbal anger and offensive language, et cetera. Did you ever have reason to fear for yourself physically?
Yeah, and again, I didn't say it here, and I don't think it's in my written report, but the one person actually lunged at me, and I thought I was going to get a fist blow. I was very afraid. I can still see exactly where I was standing. I've watched the video a couple of times. I basically just stood there while they yelled at me, but deep inside, I was very, very afraid, that particularly the one gentleman who seemed very, very angry. I thought something worse could have happened there.
And what had provoked that particular incident?
They had walked past me and had mocked my mask and I said to them, can you guys just please go home? And then they turned around and started to yell at me, and that's when the incident happened.
And how many of them?
3.
And did you consider reporting that incident to the police?
No, I didn't.
And why not?
That's a very good question. I'll tell you what I didn't do as well. CTV did call because the video was sent to CTV. And CTV called me and asked if they could use it. And I said, I'd rather not, but they really wanted to. And I said, okay, you can go ahead, but just don't use my name. So they did use it. They did use it, and they said a minister of a downtown church on Elgin Street. So
Kind of narrows the field a bit. And was that because you were fearful for your safety?
I was, and I just didn't want more attention drawn, particularly to myself.
And so similarly, your reluctance around reporting that incident to the police?
I hadn't really thought about it, but that's probably why. Yeah.
All right. Might it be possible for us to get a copy of that video?
Absolutely, and I do believe I sent it along with the written submission or a link. So you might be able to find it, but if you don't find it, I'll be more than pleased to send it to you.
All right, thanks very much. Well, those are my questions. Anything?
Just last one here. You said that your church have been sort of, there were some protesters urinating, and I don't know, do you have any vandalism happen or anything, any flag that was maybe put on the church or something like that?
No other vandalism and no flag put on the church, but we did consistently see evidence of urination. The first weekend was the worst. It was simply chaotic, and it was, I found it so distasteful that some of that was happening right in front of our dinner guests. If you can try to imagine Lisker Street beside Lisker Street beside Knox Church, there's a sidewalk right there, and there they were. Our guests were lined up, and there were protesters urinating right up against the wall there.
Did you or anyone ever try to ask them to leave, or?
Yes, we absolutely did.
Yeah, and what was the response?
They have a right to be there.
I'm a human rights lawyer. I haven't heard about the right to public urination, but we'll see where that goes.
And then on one occasion, when I pointed it out to one of the protesters, they said, well, how do you know that that's from a protester? It could be from a dog. And I said, as far as I know, dogs can't write in script.
Well said.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very much appreciated that.
You're welcome. And thank you, commissioners. And thank you very much for doing this. It's cathartic for me, but I know for many people in the downtown, and I look forward to your recommendations.
Okay. So we'll welcome up our next presenter. And
Thank you for having me. My name is Fareed Khan. I'm the founder of Canadians United Against Hate, an active member of the Ottawa Gatineau Muslim community. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this commission for allowing ordinary citizens of the National Capital Region to publicly share our stories about how we were affected by the convoy occupation. As we've seen from the public inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act, very few ordinary citizens who were directly affected were invited to appear and share our stories about how our lives were disrupted and dislocated by the so-called freedom-loving Canadians who held this city hostage. So this forum is critical to get those stories on the record. There are two specific occasions I would like to highlight where I and my work was directly impacted by the occupation protesters. For me, it began in the days before Saturday, January 29th, the first weekend when the protesters arrived. That date is a solemn one for Canadian Muslims. It's that date, it's the day when a white supremacist gunman walked into a mosque in Quebec City in 2017 and gunned down 6 Muslim men who were worshiping. January 29th, 2022 marked the 5th anniversary of that horrible day, and Canadians United Against Hate, along with members of Ottawa's faith communities, had planned to hold an interfaith vigil the evening of the 29th at the Human Rights Monument beside City Hall to remember those that were killed. As we approached the first weekend of the occupation, I was in regular contact with Councillor Catherine McKenney, the local councillor for the area, and a liaison officer from the Ottawa Police, discussing issues of location logistics and participant safety. As the weekend approached, there were frequent communications to discuss social media chatter from protesters who were threatening violence when they arrived in Ottawa. Given that some of the lead organizers of the protest were known promoters of racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, the safety of event participants and attendees was a key issue for me. By Friday, January 28th, I was advised by the Ottawa Police Liaison to cancel the event.
You're being translated, so if you could read a little bit as quickly.
Thank you. I was advised by the Ottawa Police Liaison to cancel the event, given the increasing likelihood of violence by protesters and concerns for the safety of attendees. Following discussions with Councillor McKenney and other participants, the January 29th event was cancelled on Friday afternoon, which was deeply disappointing for members of Ottawa's Muslim community and others who planned to attend. The second instance that I and others were directly impacted by the convoy occupation was on February 2nd. In January and February, I was working for an Ottawa-based international development NGO, and for weeks I was managing efforts to hold a media event at the Sir John A. Macdonald building, which faces Wellington Street. I was coordinating this event with the Parliamentary Press Gallery and with Parliamentary Protective Services on issues of safety. Participants in the event included a senator and members of organizations from Toronto, Montreal, and Western Canada. By the time the first weekend of the occupation ended, it became clear that holding the event would be impossible given safety concerns. Consequently, on Monday, January 1st, I was forced to cancel the live media event and turn it into a virtual one. One of the things the public heard often during the occupation was that the protest was about standing up for freedom. But this so-called freedom protest and the eventual aggression and violence we saw committed by protesters denied me, Ottawa's Muslim community, and others who wanted to participate in the January 29th event, our freedom to gather peacefully to mark a very solemn occasion. The protesters violated my rights and the rights of others, again when I was forced to cancel the February 2nd event, and continued to do so in various ways during the course of the occupation. In addition, the participation of protesters carrying symbols of hate like the swastika, the Confederate flag, and those carrying anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans messaging, without any actions by protest leaders or protest participants to remove these elements, said to me and many others that this was a protest that accepted and promoted hate. I also want to call attention to how Ottawa residents and Canadians were betrayed by some Conservative MPs during the occupation. By aiding and abetting the convoy protesters, these MPs violated the rights of millions of Canadians as well as their oath of office. Their support of a group of people who had as one of their goals the overthrow of the Canadian government meant that these MPs committed sedition as defined under sections 51 and 59 of the Criminal Code. Former interim Conservative Party leader Candice Bergen, current Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, and a good number of Conservative MPs committed criminal acts under these two sections of the Criminal Code by supporting the protesters, and they have yet to be held accountable for their actions. In conclusion, I want to reiterate that the rights and freedoms of tens of thousands of people in Ottawa and Gatineau were violated by the Ottawa occupation, as were the rights of millions of law-abiding Canadians. But what is most egregious is that elected members of the Conservative Party chose to side with and support an illegal protest led by people who cared for no one's rights but their own, who committed crimes under the Criminal Code, people who have yet to be held fully accountable. The residents of Ottawa-Gatineau deserve justice for what was done to them, as do millions of Canadians who saw Conservative MPs side with protest organizers who were known promoters of racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, who advocated sedition and wanted to violate the public's right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and to overthrow Canada's duly elected government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fareed. I think you can tell your comments have resonated. And I'm particularly appreciative that you've brought up the January 29th event, because I think many of us remember when that was canceled and found it deeply troubling. So, so it's good that we're going to have the opportunity to explore that a bit further with you. Monia, did you want to start with your questions?
So Farid, you don't live in downtown, right?
No, I don't. I live in Gatineau, but I lived, for the time that I've lived in the National Capital Region, I've lived most of my life in Ottawa. It's only several years ago that I moved to Gatineau.
Did you come during the occupation? Did you come to downtown? And if yes, what was your opinion about that?
Well, I tried to come downtown at some point, but at the time there were police checkpoints on the bridges. And that was time consuming, and then trying to come across, of course, the parkway was blockaded and various access points into the downtown, the so-called red zone, were blockaded. I could not meet friends. There were things that I needed to do that required me to be downtown, which I could not do. So in essence, while I was not subject to the aggression and the auditory assault that the residents of downtown were experiencing, I was pretty much holed up in my apartment because there were recommendations for people who lived in Gatineau but who had business in Ottawa to basically stay away.
And you mentioned you are a human rights activist and you were organizing this event and you were planning also the other event. Have you seen something similar happening in the city, or anyhow quite similar to, to what happened?
Absolutely not. I mean, as I said, I've lived in the Ottawa region for more than 2 decades. For years, we've seen protests come into the downtown and take place. I've been part of some of those protests, but the one thing that all those protests had in common was that they came in, they made a lot of noise. Sometimes streets were closed off for a few hours or even a day. The message was delivered by the people who were participants in those protests, and then they left. And people could get back to their lives. And I think the residents of Ottawa, Gatineau, are used to that. What they are not used to is an occupying force that came into Ottawa the way this convoy protest did, basically taking up downtown, demonstrating aggression and violence against residents of this city. There's the one incident where someone tried to set fire in the lobby of an apartment building. I have a friend who suffers from head trauma, who lives in the red zone, who told me that she and her daughter felt like prisoners and she was assaulted. Her senses were assaulted by the constant blaring of the horns and the fact that she'd go out, she'd be out with her mask when she had to get things done. And she was verbally harassed by people who were clearly protesters.
Last question I have here. When your event, the one that you were organizing about the commemoration of the Islamophobic attack on January 29th, and then you said that you were in touch with Councillor McKinney and with the police officer, the liaison at the Ottawa Police Services. And when they canceled the event, or before they canceled the event, did the police did they say that they are ready to come and protect you?
No, they were saying that what I was told was that based on online chatter that they had seen, that there was the likelihood of violence taking place. I issued a media release noting the cancellation of the event. I got contacted by multiple media to do interviews on TV and radio. And in the aftermath of that, I was harassed online via LinkedIn, via Twitter, and on Facebook. People calling me a terrorist, people saying that I should go back to where I came from. And even in one instance, there was a death threat. So obviously, what the police were telling me, resonated, because I've had to deal with this sort of thing before when I've spoken publicly about issues. And in this case, clearly there was a lot of social media chatter by supporters of the convoy who were watching for anybody who was out there trying to counter the narrative that they were putting forth. And while I've dealt with this before, this felt different, because it's not just that I was threatened online and that there were online threats of possible violence taking place where we were going to hold our event, but when those people sort of hunkered down in the downtown core on Wellington Street and in the areas that were closed off, it felt like we had been occupied by revolutionaries who did not have any interests at heart but their own, who cared little for the rights of millions of Canadians or the residents of Ottawa-Gatineau, who cared little for public safety because they, thought that the whole thing with vaccination mandates and mask mandates was an attempt to violate their freedoms and rights. And I am the child of refugee parents. Members of my family were killed when my parents were young, just for the sake of the faith that they practiced. So I know what it's like. I've been told stories about what it's like to, face real violations of your basic human rights. And what these people were doing, they were like children throwing a tantrum because they were being inconvenienced. But it was worse, because in throwing their tantrum, they violated the rights of people, not just in this city and region, but the rights of people across the country.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fareed. I had a couple of questions about the January 29th event as well. And one picks up on Monia's question. As the concerns were mounting in advance, you're seeing the social media chatter, the police are seeing the social media chatter, the concerns are growing that there could be violence. Did the police in any way put on the table, and I'm not saying this is what you would have wanted to do, but did they put on the table any offer of how they would be prepared to provide protection or a security perimeter or anything of that sort if you had decided to go ahead with the event?
Well, yes, initially there was discussion about providing appropriate police presence for the event. But then as we got closer to the date, and then by the Friday, given the level of chatter that was happening and the reports about how big this was and concerns about threat to public safety, the police basically recommended by Friday that, look, given the concerns that we have and the demands that will be made on police, we don't know if we can provide the level of protection. In addition, there was discussion by that time of basically closing off that whole area around City Hall and not having anything happen. So essentially, by the end of Friday, it was taken out of my hands. The decision was made to cancel the event by early Friday, like early afternoon Friday. But by late afternoon, early evening, it was. I was told, or I received an email saying that the entire zone around the City Hall would be a no-go zone.
So even if you had decided to go ahead with it, you wouldn't have been able to do it there because you wouldn't have had access to that area?
And that's why I say that my rights and the rights of others who were going to participate were violated by these people, because they created a situation where there was a threat to public safety, and then ultimately the city and the police decided that out of concern for public safety, it would be better not to have anything happening on City Hall grounds.
So the police were essentially telling you, we're not confident we could keep you safe.
Essentially, yes. Yes.
And the event was held online, as I recall.
Yes,
right?
we changed it to an online event, which was obviously doesn't have the same impact.
Tell us a bit more about that. What's the difference? Why would it have mattered so much for this to be in person, and what was lost by having to do it online?
Well, I mean, we were still at the height of the pandemic at that point. We were in a lockdown still. And gathering together in person would have resonated with people. Also, visually, the coverage of the event in the media would have reminded Canadians about this horrible anniversary. It would have reminded people about the deadly Islamophobia that we have seen not just in January 2017, but then again in Toronto in September of 2020, and then in June 2021 in London. Muslims are the only faith community whose members have been killed in acts of hate in my lifetime. And to have the event in person brings together people who want to be with others, to show respect for the people who were killed, as well as to demonstrate to Canadians that we have a very real issue in this country with hate, not just against Muslims, but also against Jews, against Black people, against Indigenous people. And we need to stand up in the face of that hate, and we need to show a physical presence to say, no, we're not going to back down. So while we did end up holding the event online, and I can't remember, I think there was maybe about 60 people who signed on for that, and it allowed us to do virtually what we were going to do in person. It just didn't have the same impact in my view. I think that anybody who's attended any sort of I mean, we've done a lot of virtual meetings over the last 2 years. And initially I was asked to make my presentation virtually for this, and I requested to come down in person because I think being here in person holds greater weight. I mean, it's not that you wouldn't listen if I was making the presentation virtually, I know you would, but I felt the need to come down in person, to be in front of you, to do this, because I think it resonates more so when you're doing something like this or any sort of solemn or somber event in person than doing it virtually.
I think many people can appreciate that. Maybe one last question for me. I want to ask you about Canadians United Against Hate, your organization. And I've known of your work, obviously, for many years in that capacity, but actually it occurs to me, I'm not clear as to whether this is or is not part of the mandate, but would you have been receiving individual complaints from people about incidents of hate that they were experiencing during February, or is that not the way the organization works?
It's not a formal part of it, but I do not reject people who contact me to say, look, this is what happened to me. I try to direct them to the appropriate body. We don't have the capacity to pursue any sort of legal actions with regard to people who have been victims of hate, but we are there to support them. We're there to try to provide resources, connect them with appropriate resources to help them, and also to call attention, both publicly as well as in the media, to people who have been victims of hate, whether it's online, on social media, or in real life.
So did you have people who were coming to you in February with any of those kinds of reports?
We had a lot of people commenting online on both on our social media forums about what they had been dealing with, what they had witnessed. In my personal network of people, there were people who I know who lived in the downtown zone that was cordoned off, who related to me personal stories about what they had experienced, what the mental stress and anxiety that they were experiencing, and also the anger. Anger not only at the protesters, but also at elected politicians who would choose to stand with people who were committing aggression and assault, as opposed to the people who were being victimized by that aggression and assault.
Thank you very much for being here today, Fareed. I know we've both found it very helpful, and you've brought before us a very important part of what happened right at the beginning of the occupation that we absolutely can't forget.
Could I make one closing comment and just read into the record something that I wasn't able to do in my formal remarks? I mentioned sections 51 and 59 of the Criminal Code, and for the record, this is what it says under section 51. It says that everyone who does an act of violence in order to intimidate Parliament or the legislature of a province is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment. Section 59 defines sedition as words that express seditious intention, libel that expresses seditious intention, and participating in a seditious conspiracy to carry out a seditious intention. Section 59 also says that anyone shall be presumed to have a seditious intention who teaches, advocates, publishes, or circulates any writing that advocates the use of force without authority of the law as a means to achieve a change of government in Canada. And I want to call attention to the fact that the so-called Memorandum of Understanding, which was published, called for the overthrow of the Canadian government. And this was something that was well known to the elected members of Parliament, and yet some of those elected members of Parliament chose to stand with people who called for sedition.
All right. Thank you very much, Fareed. So we will welcome up our next presenter.
I'm going to be reading. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm going to be reading my statement. I've had a lot of difficulty writing all this down because there's so many instances of distress caused by the convoy occupation that I experienced and witnessed. And frankly, writing it down was re-traumatizing. And the reason why I'm here is I don't want this to happen again. So, my name is Dawn, and I'm here today to speak about my experience of the convoy occupation as a queer, disabled, low-income woman from a refugee background. I've also had many disabled people in my area. I live a couple blocks away from Parliament, ask me to speak to their experiences of the convoy occupation as well. When I was a child, I lived in a developing third world country during riots and war. From a young age, I've had glimpses of how quickly mob insurrection can begin and what long-lasting trauma it can create. I've lived in public housing alone in Centretown for 20 years. I'm used to protests and demonstrations downtown. There have been many protests during the 20 years that I've lived here, but none that I've experienced have been as personally disruptive and disturbing to me and my neighbors as the convoy occupation. It re-traumatized me and others who are disabled or of queer or immigrant or refugee backgrounds. The number of bylaws that were broken and the level of fear, discomfort, and intimidation and inconvenience it imposed on both myself and the residents of this downtown core, I've never seen this before. I'm just gonna I'm speaking to the list that I made. So the impact of the protest tactics, this is what I observed. Daily convoy pickup trucks and other vehicles speeding down my street at all hours and leaving pedestrians feeling unsafe. And I live a block away from a public school where children go every day. The use of noise, now that is a tactic of psychological warfare. That's what the Americans used in Vietnam. And there are many other instances where it's been used. Think of the biblical incidents where the horns of Jericho, idling trucks on Lion Street, honking horns for 12 hours or more, even honking them once there was a court order issued against the honking. They produced loud, extreme, sustained noise and air pollution. I have a chronic pain condition. I also run air fans and white noise in my apartment to just help with the tinnitus that I have. And I could still hear them through all the barriers that I put up. I put earplugs in my ears. I could still hear it. I couldn't sleep. I lost my appetite. The emissions of the pollution, bad, very bad for my asthma. My dog kept barking nonstop and was shaking. I have video of, I did a video log of the whole thing from when it started to when it, but I can't show it here because it's too traumatic. I still jump when I hear a loud noise or a horn. And at the time of the commission, I was scheduled to go see my dentist because my chronic pain condition requires I see them on a regular basis. The convoy blocked access to essential medical appointments. The trucks parked on Queen Street and Lyon forced my dentist to close its office. I had the beginnings of a dental abscess, and the blockade meant the preventive treatment I needed was not available. I was only able to get it treated after the convoy left, and by that time I needed to see a dental specialist and pay for it out of pocket to the tune of over $1,000. I wear a mask for my own health reasons, and moreover, I'm a secondary caregiver to my 85-year-old mom who has Alzheimer's, so I wear a mask to protect myself and others. I was personally harassed by convoy supporters in the neighborhood who followed me and screamed and yelled at me for wearing a mask, moved close up to my face, and then they started to videotape my angry reaction to the harassment. They taunted me, and they told me they would post my reaction on Facebook and dox me. On the corner of Lyon and Queen Street, there was a truck with an anti-trans slogan written to its body. It was parked there for days. My neighborhood is home to many queer persons, and seeing this kind of hate speech, it was extremely upsetting. On Lyon and Cooper Street, convoy supporters pitched tents that completely blocked off the street and also parked in the parking spot of Hijinks, which is a store that distributes food for neighbors in need and the homeless. They couldn't get their food. An elderly refugee neighbor confided in me that she was terrified of going out alone because she had been assaulted by convoy supporters when she asked them to move their barbecue and camping gear off the lawn of her local church. She said that since the convoy arrived, she was getting flashbacks of war trauma she experienced as a young girl when the Russians invaded her city in Finland. This convoy also triggered flashbacks of my childhood trauma when I lived overseas in India. The city put a dumpster in the driveway of Centennial Park Public School as convoy supporters were littering along the street. Convoy supporters then used that dumpster at night as their personal latrine. I couldn't even go on a safety walk organized by Catherine McKinney because of the aggressive nature of the protesters. That safety walk went once and then it was canceled. We had no or little help from the police or the city. I complained about the noise to the City of Ottawa bylaw on January 30th. With no effective action or response from bylaw officers, no follow-up. I made calls, filed online reports about the noise infractions, nothing. I reported the trucks parked on Lyon and Queen blocking the Lyon Street OC Transpo bus and idling their engines. There were gas cans littered on that street. I took photos. Nobody gave nobody gave a crap. No one came, nothing was done. I asked an officer on patrol to investigate. She called it in. I waited for an hour outdoors, Nothing. I even called the RCMP about the gas cans. Nothing was done. I felt trapped in a way that I hadn't since I was a child. Now, the impact of social media. Okay, because I got no help from the police or the city, I joined community online groups on social media as a means of trying to find a way to protect ourselves, a grassroots solution to our problems brought on by the convoy occupation. I spend a lot of time on social media. I'm involved in animal rescue, and I know a lot of people on both sides of the argument, both supporters and convoy supporters, and both people who supported the mask and vaccine mandates. That the convoy supporters gaslighted and trivialized my experience of the noise behaviors of their fellow convoy supporters downtown. And those that said, oh, it's so sad about it, but you know, they acknowledged that it was bad. They just said, oh, that's unfortunately necessary and collateral damage. Pat King personally threatened on Facebook to dox our Facebook group members and any other counter-protest group on social media. Humans were not the only ones who were hurt by the convoy tactics. The convoy occupation in the down core also put intense long-term stress on people's pets, which added to stress on humans. My own dog, was very confused by it all, wouldn't stop talking and shaking even after the horns stopped. Rescue organizations such as No Surrender Ottawa stepped in to foster animals to get them out of the downtown core. And my dog has never been the same since. She's super protective of me. She's aggressive to other people and animals. I had to leave Ottawa on February 17th because of the stress of the noise, the air pollution. Everything was getting to me. I couldn't sleep at night. Even after the horn stopped, I'd have this echo of the horn noise in my head. I was in pain, I lost my appetite, and so I called my sister, who lives out of province, and we left on Ottawa on February 17th to stay there until the situation settled. Convoy occupation cost me and my family over $1,600 as I did not have the money for a flight out of Ottawa or a return flight after the situation had subsided due to the Emergencies Act. Getting out of Ottawa on my own was beyond my means as a person with a disability and an extremely limited income. If the Ottawa Police, OPP, RCMP had done their job and made the convoy leave after the first weekend they arrived, I would not have these huge expenses, and I certainly wouldn't be in such a mentally bad state. I was fortunate that I had a family who would take me in, but there's other people in this area. They don't have the money to do that. They don't have the friends to do that. I had an advantage that other people didn't. But this is what the convoy protesters failed to realize, that the actions of their freedom of expression affected students, low-income people, disabled people, people just struggling to survive, and elderly people on limited income. They thought that we deserved to be psychologically harassed with noise and pollution for 3 weeks, and they thought doing this, and somehow, it would win us over to their cause. It's just really bad politics. You don't convince anyone of the righteousness of your cause by psychologically assaulting them with noise and noxious gas emissions. It reminded me of being bullied as a child.
Dawn, maybe if you could wrap up in a minute
Sure.
or so and we can move to questions.
So I want to say, the last thing I want to say that is, quote, Bob Ray. A truck is not a speech. A horn is not a voice. An occupation is not a protest. A blockade is not freedom. It blocks the liberty of all. A demand to overthrow a government is not dialogue. The expression of hatred is not a difference of opinion. A lie is not the truth.
Thank you so much for that, Dawn. That was very powerful, very personal, and very wide-ranging, which is very important for us. And I want to particularly acknowledge what you said at the beginning, that even compiling that, even writing that, was re-traumatizing for you. I think it's important for us to hear that, but also want to assure you that if from that you'd like some support of any kind, please do let our colleagues at the registration desk know, and they can certainly assist with that.
Thank you.
Monia, did you have some questions you wanted to begin with?
Well, maybe I will start with one. You spoke about, you said something about the protester pitched their tents, and you gave like a local place or something. I didn't get
Okay.
that.
There's
So
a
they had tents
Yeah, they had a camper. There was tents.
in the
There's
street? In the street?
Yeah, if you see, I've got photos of Kent Street. Okay, the story is called Hijinks.
Oh, yeah, this is what I was asking
Yeah.
about more. Okay.
Yeah, Hijinks store.
Okay.
So there's a
Yeah.
camper. I wouldn't say a tent. Pardon me. I have to correct myself. They put their camper in the driveway without Hijinks' permission, and they blocked off the route by which people come in to get food. And that Hijinks is a store that also provides help for people, homeless people and neighbors who are in need. So
Do you think they made it on purpose?
I think so too, because the ladies who run it are very protective of their people, and they don't take any crap. Like they will stand up to injustice. But they didn't get any help from the police to remove that camper, and it was on the ladies who run the place. That was their property, and that camper just went smack in there and didn't move.
You lived in this city for a long time, yeah, you said that you really you know your city, can you tell us a little bit more about, and you said at some point you felt a little bit privileged because you had despite everything that happened to you, you said you were able to get somehow over that, or can you describe with us, or can you share with us some of the stories that you heard about people who maybe didn't have a chance, for example, to leave, or didn't have, any possibility to get food, or did you have?
I have a neighbor upstairs who she said she was not able, she has family, but she's not able to leave her place because she doesn't have the money to leave. And it's her place.
Yeah.
It's her place, I stayed as long as I could myself. I live in a public housing building, and I'm speaking to the experience of a lot of people in public housing, that once you're in public housing, you don't have a choice to leave it. You're there because you can't afford a regular rent. You're there. A lot of people in my building are disabled, or they're new immigrants, or they're retired. If you have a limited income, you have limited access to leave. I'm just very blessed that I have a family that helped me out.
What happened to your, for example, disabled neighbor?
She stayed.
Yeah.
She stayed. When I'm talking about disabled, I'm talking about the full breadth of disability.
Sure.
I'm not just talking about mobility
Yeah.
disabled. And I'd like to also speak on how people have this odd perception that disability just means, well, you're in a chair. But I think the speaker previously talked about a friend who had a head injury,
Yes.
and I can speak to my own experience having this chronic pain because it's in my head, is that noise it sticks in there, it stays in there. And there are a lot of different kinds of disabled people in my building, and it affected them all. Some people, doesn't affect them, but certain kinds of disability affected more than others.
And you compared it to torture.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I just had one thing I wanted to ask you about, Dawn. You shared a fairly impressive list of all of your attempts to get bylaw officers or the police to do something about what you were experiencing and witnessing. I think you referred to certainly the very obvious parking infractions and your concerns about the gas as two of the examples. But it sounded like you did that many times. I'm wondering if, I don't need a precise number, but do you have a general sense of how many times you made complaints to the police or bylaw?
I started making complaints to the bylaw, I think, around January 30th. On the bylaw office, City of Ottawa, and I asked for a recording. What do you call that? When you call them and they give you a ticket for your,
Right.
Yeah. And I have that somewhere. But then, as it got worse, I would call the police, and I was encouraging my friends to call police, and they were all getting the same response, like, we're not getting anything back. I said, call them again. So I would say it was up to six times over the period of 2 weeks, because you get frustrated after a while, you know.
And these were complaints to bylaw and the police?
They were to the police, to bylaw,
Right.
and when I saw the gas cans, that's when I called RCMP.
Right.
And that day, I also came across the cop on duty in the patrol car, and I talked to her about the gas cans, and I said, could you see about, can you get something done about that? And she called in, and she said, well, they're gonna, I called it in, and they're gonna send someone to look. And I just waited, hung out there for an hour to see, nothing happened.
And what kind of, when you were making these calls, what kind of response or reaction would you get?
The response was, yes, we're getting a lot of calls.
All right. I think we get the point. Thank you so much for being here, Dawn. As I said, your testimony was notably personal, and that's really important for us to hear. And we salute you for the courage of coming forward. So thank you so much.
Hello. My name is Judy. I would like to, first of all, thank the commissioners for giving me, a citizen of downtown Ottawa, the opportunity to share my experience during the occupation of my neighborhood by the truck convoys and their supporters. I live in an apartment building within the Centretown area that was cordoned off and basically under siege by the invasion of trucks and supporters. I'm a retired teacher and I live alone. Before the date that the first trucks arrived, it was all over social media and the news services that the trucks and truckers and supporters intended to stay. This was not a secret. However, it seems that everyone knew about it, except the police and our government elected officials. It is now quite evident that all our so-called protective services were completely unprepared for what happened. However, what happened astounded me as the enormous trucks roared in, blaring their horns and spewing diesel fumes. What really astounded me was the almost welcoming reception they received by police, and soon after from certain elected members of our parliament. The trucks had police escorts leading them right downtown. Once parked, I saw police smiling and joking around with the drivers on our TV coverage. I tried not to go near them except when I absolutely had to. The horns were incessant, 24/7. I don't have a physical disability, and it was torture. Surely they were breaking noise bylaws, and yet no one stopped them until a young student herself figured out a way to silence them after days of endless noise and torture for the residents beside the streets where the trucks parked. The country seems to have forgotten or were unaware that downtown Ottawa contains more than just the Parliament buildings and a canal. Students, families, elderly folks, and young children actually live, work, and go to school on these streets. The truckers and their supporters pulled in and basically set up camp and behaved as if they owned our streets. They were aggressive towards masked residents and refused to mask themselves in shops. At one point, I had to venture out of my apartment to buy food at the grocery on Metcalfe and Lisgar Street. I don't have a car, so I walked there. As I approached Metcalfe, the fumes were choking from the huge trucks, and the blaring horns were deafening. There were no police in sight. A group of truckers entered the grocery store and loudly proceeded to make their way through the store. A shopper approached them and asked them to mask. They proceeded to loudly harass her. I went to get the store manager, who told me he could not do anything. The police were not responding to any of his calls. I quickly grabbed what necessities I needed and left for home. For the first time since arriving in Ottawa in 1977, feeling totally unsafe and unprotected by our legal services. I was horrified to see the invaders wrapped in Canadian flags and some carrying swastikas on our downtown streets. I could not believe this was happening in our city and that the police were not stopping this. In fact, I never saw any police except in the cars escorting the trucks where they wished to go, or on TV chatting up the occupiers. What a difference in action from when we saw Indigenous groups blocking one road. This was not a demonstration. I have witnessed and even participated myself in many demonstrations as a resident of the nation's capital. There would be a march, perhaps for an hour or two, and speeches on Parliament Hill. And then everyone went home. What happened in Ottawa was an invasion, an occupation. When I saw open fires on the streets and people walking by with jerry cans of gasoline, I was terrified of fire and explosions. Fire trucks would not be able to get through the streets. I could not believe that this was being allowed. To top it all off, when the hot tubs and bouncy castles were set up, it was completely outrageous. Still, there was absolutely no political action. Only a handful of politicians, Catherine McKenney, Joel Harden, and a few others, actually posted safety information to the residents and walked the streets daily. No one else did anything to protect residents. The force was out assisting the truckers. For me, the most terrifying time was when I learned of attempts to set fires in the lobbies of residential apartment buildings and tie the exterior doors shut. I live a block away from one such attempt. Demonstration, this was attempted murder. I had a packed bag. I had a packed bag ready to flee to friends outside the cordoned off area if necessary. But why should I have to leave my home? How was this ever allowed to go on? Absolutely nothing was done by any level of government or from our so-called various levels of protective services until money and international trade was at stake. Threats to take down the elected government were not enough for action. Only the blocked bridges finally brought this to an end. Thank God for the War Measures Act, and too bad it wasn't declared sooner. Our local and provincial politicians were busy passing the buck or hiding, and the police were squabbling internally. We would still be under siege if the federal government did not act when they did.
Thank you, Judy. You've captured some very important pieces of this very eloquently, so thank you for that. Monia, did you want to start with any questions?
Please go.
You go first? Okay.
Yes.
You have very pointedly highlighted the inaction of the police. And I'm wondering if you yourself had any encounters or engagement with the police, either were there ever times maybe by phone that you tried to report anything you were seeing, or any conversations you had with police on the streets?
I tried to keep off the streets. I felt trapped, and only went out when I absolutely had to get food or pharmaceuticals. The action I saw, or inaction I saw from the police, was from TV footage, where I would see them laughing with truckers and basically standing by. There were always shots of groups of police standing by. But while bylaws were blatantly broken, there was no action to stop it. And I was seeing all this from TV coverage because I was too afraid to be on the streets.
So did you feel that you could have turned to the police if you had needed to?
No, I did not.
And how did that leave you feeling?
I was very frightened and deeply disappointed. I never, ever thought, as a citizen of Canada, that I would be in a situation like this. I always trusted that our police were there to protect citizens. And this was the first time in my experience, and I'm a senior, that I ever felt that they were not there to protect me.
And that's a pretty powerful feeling. You talk about not being able to go out, being too fearful to go out. Were there any appointments or activities, therefore, I guess either maybe that were even canceled or that you simply weren't able to go to because of the situation?
Well, it was the time of the lockdown. So most of my appointments and activities were done virtually at that time. What couldn't happen were deliveries, especially once the perimeter was set up. So I was worried that I could not get deliveries of items that I might need. And I was worried that if I, in fact, did have to leave, that anyone trying to come to pick me up would not be able to get to me. So there were sleepless nights, and I was becoming quite anxious.
There's obviously particular needs and in some instances vulnerabilities that seniors face, which might suggest therefore that officials would be particularly aware of the situation of seniors in a time like this. Did you ever hear or sense anything about city officials or police or anyone wanting to reach out to seniors, sending any kind of reassuring messages to seniors, indicating where seniors might be able to turn to if they needed help, anything of that sort?
The only such messages that I received were through Catherine McKinney on Twitter. In fact, I'm not a huge social media user. I subscribed to Twitter so that I could get the messages from Joel Harden and Catherine McKinney, who were reporting what was safe and what was not safe to do. That was the only safety information that I was getting.
Right. Thank you. Those are my questions. Did you have anything you wanted to ask?
Yeah. You spoke about the fire in the street. Can you tell us a little bit more? And you said that was scary. I'm very curious to know, like, did you have a balcony? Were you seeing people?
I had a balcony, but it was winter, so I was not on the balcony.
But still, you can see whatever is happening, right?
What I did see with my own eyes were supporters and truckers walking down the streets holding cans of fuel.
Yes.
I did not see the open barbecues. I saw those on TV because that was happening at Confederation Square and further downtown where they were preparing food. So I did see TV footage of the cans of gas and open barbecues and fires in Confederation Park to keep warm. They were making fires just to keep themselves warm.
Also, I think I wanted to ask about, did you see children in the street?
Good question. I saw children walking with supporters, which totally shocked me, especially when the supporters were carrying Nazi flags. I could not understand how families would bring their children into such a situation, which I felt was dangerous. There were children because the local school at one point had to be closed.
I think that was maybe, yeah, I wanted to ask something, but I forgot right now. But I don't know, maybe, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. And that will bring us to our final presenter, I believe. Yes.
Hi. You will be recording today, right? I'm pulling up my own voice memo here. I want to remember what I said.
Oh. And it will be available, actually, and,
perfect.
and fairly quickly. It's available on our YouTube channel.
Okay, fantastic. I'm Andrea Harden. I want to first acknowledge I'm here on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and I'm thankful to be here. I have to be honest with you. I'm coming here today, and I'm speaking from the heart. I've been really busy lately. I'm a parent of a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I have a busy job, and I've been helping on the strike line, and I have a son in a musical theater. So I have not
Life is
prepared
happening.
a statement. There you go. But I do have a lot to say. So I'm going to speak to some experiences with Ottawa Police during the convoy. I'm going to speak to some experiences about being on a safety walk, what I saw on Twitter and some friends of mine who live downtown. And most importantly, I think I'll speak to my experiences participating in what's now called the Battle of Billings Bridge. So I think before I say anything, I do feel a need to situate myself. I am someone who identifies as being a social movement organizer. I've had the privilege of working with several different NGOs, as well as volunteering and participating in social movement organizing in a number of different facets, primarily the environmental movement, but social justice as well. I have organized demonstrations on Parliament Hill. I have organized marches. I've conducted nonviolent civil disobedience. I've engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience in Ottawa and elsewhere across the country. So that's kind of my experience base. And I must say, when the convoy came to Ottawa, immediately it was just extremely apparent to myself, and I think anybody who has done social movement organizing in Ottawa, that the treatment of this occupation compared to the treatment of folks who have organized here in the past, particularly Indigenous and BIPOC folks, it was just completely different, utterly different. I remember once organizing a rally on Parliament Hill and bringing some props and going through all of the proper protocol, and was kicked off Parliament Hill because I had a stick, and that was considered a potential weapon. I've been threatened with arrest for having a group of folks on Wellington Street talking about climate justice, simply by not crossing when the light was red. So seeing a bunch of trucks in our downtown and witnessing police watch this happen from the sidelines was disturbing, to say the least. I'll also share that my brother is Joel Harden. He's the MPP. He's my brother, and he's also my representative here locally. I went on a safety walk with him and my partner. We walked around down Bank Street, and at the time my office was at Bank and Slater, and it was pretty surreal to be walking past and hearing the horns blaring and look up to where my office is and see that space occupied. I witnessed what appeared to be an Ottawa resident being yelled at by truckers. I don't remember the circumstances of which. I must say I also witnessed a huge melee, if that's the use of the word properly, while I was there. There were people, I guess my opinion is, there were people that were driving this that clearly were organized and had certain opinions, but I think there was a lot of people there that got swept up in, for probably a lot of different reasons. I saw people there with their kids walking around outside Parliament Hill. Some folks trying to engage us. We were all masked, 3 of us walking together. And I think folks really felt like they were on the right side of history, that they were fighting for freedom and this was the right thing to do. I think a lot of people are legitimately hurting. People who have lost jobs during the pandemic, people who have been torn away from their family, and I feel that too. I get that, but I also understand and believe science and that we actually have a duty to protect those who are most vulnerable, and strongly believe that as well. And I also believe, I'm a big believer, obviously, in protest, like I said, the right to protest. But whenever I've engaged in acts of nonviolent civil disobedience as a marshal or as a participant, putting people's safety and making sure people are heard was a big part of that, and I didn't see that happening. I guess I'm going to skip forward. I'll tell you that one of my colleagues had to move out of downtown, of the occupied area. I remember being on phone calls, meetings with them, and hearing the blaring horns incessantly, and they made the choice to move out. I know somebody who was in the building that was referenced before, where a fire was started, and I know the police and convoy folks deny the fact that that was related to the convoy, but undeniably, I feel like that's a distraction, because undeniably, the chaos that was allowed to happen downtown led to that situation, and that is not okay. So fast forward, I go to a march of about 4,000 people, I think, through the glebe and areas. I went with a number of my neighbors. All of us felt like it was important to stand up and say something, do something, seeing what was happening downtown. And went home that night, and I think folks were feeling okay. You know, that was good, but more needs to be done. This is, you know, governments are failing us, the police are failing us. Woke up the next morning, I realized I'm going over time here. Do you want me to stop so you can question, or should I keep going?
Finish this part off, yeah.
Okay. So I woke up the next morning, and my text loop for my street that gets used for child minding usually, and organizing party things and street things, folks saying there's a group of convoy folks that are going to go down Riverside, which is close to where we live. I live in Old Ottawa Southeast area. And what are we going to do? And somebody posted on our Facebook group in our neighborhood to show up. Thought, okay. Well, you know, they asked if I wanted to go, and I said, yes, let's go. So it was me and I think 4 or 5 moms from our street. Dad stayed home, took care of the kids. We showed up at this street corner, and I was madly just messaging every organizer I knew in Ottawa, saying, you got to show up. You got to go to Riverside and Bank, because I don't know what's happening, but people are going to show up, and the trucks are coming, and you know, something's going to go down. I show up, and it's about 30 of us to start on a street corner. And again, having organized for many years, I spoke up and said, has anybody here, you know, engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience or understands what might be involved in you know, walking in front of these trucks? And nobody kind of stood forward. And I said, okay, I've done things like this before, can I help? And folks said yes. So I made the initial suggestion, why don't we walk in a circle in the crosswalk, keeping each other safe, and we can hold the trucks for as long as we can hold them. And the initial idea was not necessarily to hold them all day, which is what happened, but to walk in a circle and kind of do this as much as we could, but knowing it was probably going to end at some point. We were 30 people. So about 15 minutes later, the trucks start coming down the street, and folks are kind of going in a circle, and pickup trucks and at least one big rig started coming up. And there was a moment, and again, a bit of this is foggy for me. There was a moment when a pickup truck was coming forward, and it was very clear to me they were inching forward closer and closer to this group of people. And I just began becoming really worried that they were going to push through this crowd of people. And I suppose I felt sense of responsibility. Sorry.
No, for sure.
Apparently I need to unpack some of this. So I threw my back against the pickup truck because it felt like the right thing to do in the moment. It was pretty intense. I think at least 2 people joined me shortly after. And there was quite a couple of minutes of them pushing me forward and blaring on their horn. I have it on video. I suppose I could send it to you. I videotaped it all somehow. But we stopped them. We did not allow them forward. And that was important. I truly believe that was important. And again, sorry, I know I'm going over time.
No, do finish this off, please.
Okay. So I guess it was about 10 minutes later the cops arrived. And the first thing they did is they ran forward, and I was still against the truck at the front. And the first thing that came out of that police officer's mouth is, "You understand that you can be arrested for this." And I was clearly quite emotional at the time, so I screamed and pointed towards downtown, "Why don't you go arrest them?" The second thing he said is, "Who is the leader?" And to which I responded, "We are all leaders." To which he responded, "I'm not talking to you." So, from that point on, to summarize, I think, try to move a little quicker. So many more people throughout the day came. People I know from picking up my kid at the local school, from the dog park, some from social movement organizing. I think it was over 1,000 people. We stood there all day. It was the most organic thing that I've ever participated in. It was not a planned event. There was no one organizer. This was folks who showed up and were at a breaking point with the lack of action by government, by the lack of action and complicity of the police in all of this, that were taking a stand and saying enough is enough. And I truly feel like that was the domino that knocked everything over, that led to the end of this occupation. And I think that I have a lot of things to say about what happened on that day, and maybe when you talk to me and ask questions, I can tell you more. But maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you for sharing that, Andrea, and including the emotion of it. I don't think any of us can really imagine what that moment with your back against the truck must have felt like, to say the least. I'm sure at times you've wondered if that's all about courage or all about recklessness or a little bit of both.
Yep.
But obviously had huge impact. Did you want to start with questions? Or yep.
Yeah. I would like to go back to this. I know it's very emotional and difficult, but I would like to go back to this, what is it called, the Battle of the Bridge, Building Bridge, and how you said you came there, you didn't know what to expect, but you wanted to give a sign to the city or to the decision maker that this is not tenable or acceptable anymore. Can you describe, you said you described it already, but can you say what really happened, especially the police presence there? Did you feel that they were, I mean, obviously they did not, but did you feel that they protected? Who are they protecting more?
Okay, so that's a very good question. I described what happened when they first arrived. After that, they kind of hung back, I would say, as the group of folks, as the crowd grew. We had about 35 trucks, I believe, mostly pickup trucks, many of them with sort of Canadian flags, some sort of weird mix of the Canadian-American flag, some of them with sort of the jerry cans of fuel that we've heard here before. Police kind of stood back, didn't really engage a lot with what was happening. And what was happening, it was, again, this really incredible organic thing that was happening was myself and others talking to folks, bringing them into circles and saying, what's next? We're here now. What is it that we want? Where do we want to go with this? And hearing over and over again, we're not willing to let these trucks go downtown. We're not moving. Okay, so what does that mean? And what that led to was a number of folks going from truck to truck, engaging and talking with convoy supporters. And I think that was a particularly incredible part of the day. I personally didn't do it, and I'll speak to the role that I played, but soon, because it has to do with the police. But I think it was a pretty incredible thing, and what I kept hearing over and over again by neighbors who were showing up and folks I knew was that a lot of the convoy supporters, most of them, had no idea why folks would be opposing them, that they thought that they would be welcomed into downtown Ottawa and that they were on the right side of history and they were fighting for freedom. And, you know, I really think that does speak to the impact of social media on our society and how you really can choose, or in the way that you engage in social media, you will see what you want to see, really. And these folks were seeing freedom fighters coming to downtown Ottawa. And when they were stopped and engaged with folks saying, somebody tried to light a fire in a building, you know, there are folks that are being harassed or even hurt for having their masks on. I think some of them were actually really quite shocked by that and shocked by the reaction. Others were more hard-lined and refused to engage. I spent the day going from group to group, keeping my eyes out for places where I thought conflict might arise. Having the background that I have in social movement, I thought the best role that I could play was to try to diffuse situations that might be coming up, because what I didn't want to see was a fight breakout, because I didn't think that was going to send the message that we wanted to send, which is that these folks should not be allowed downtown. This should not be the responsibility of people standing up, but here we are and we are doing it. But I didn't think that violence or an interaction like that was the way forward. So I went to situations where tensions were arising, where I heard yelling, and I engaged in tactics that I've learned to help listen to people and acknowledge frustration and use words to de-escalate the situation. I also conveniently had a cowbell, something a neighbor had brought that I didn't realize would actually be a very useful instrument to both de-escalate with members of the convoy who showed up, as well as members of the police force. So coming, I guess, full circle to your question, we know that Pat King put a call out to his supporters to go to Billings Bridge and to confront or support the folks who are being held by us. So I think a number of us were on alert for that, and certainly there were folks who showed up that were clearly convoy supporters who attempted on a number of different occasions to engage folks who were there in opposition and to gaslight them, essentially, and to varying degrees spew hate, whether it was making fun of folks wearing masks or speaking some really horrible things about vaccines, but a whole mix of things. And I gotta say, every time that happened, when it crossed into a territory that I thought began spewing hates, I rang the cowbell, which is extraordinarily loud, and managed to block out their live streaming, because at that point, my goal was I don't want them to be heard over social media, and I also don't want them to be heard by a crowd full of people who are agitated, and I don't want a fight to break out. So that's a role I played, and I also played it with police. So maybe I'll give you one example. Where we ended up at the end of the day was, after hours and hours, folks kind of negotiated this situation where if the convoy supporters removed their signs and gave up jerry cans, and again, this was people negotiating this, not police, then we would say yes to the police, turning them around and escorting them backwards, away from downtown. So this was a very slow process that happened truck by truck, but it did happen. And at one point, towards the end of the day, there was a truck that police officers were about to let go, and my partner, who was there with me, yelled jerry can because this truck still had a jerry can in it. And that police officer did not like him doing that because I guess his perspective was this truck needed to move. And he got up in his face very quickly and was quite confrontational. So I ran towards my partner. Excuse me. I ran towards my partner and basically tried to intervene and say, let's calm things down, which is what I was doing. And the police officer took his hand on me and pushed me aside quite hard, which really upset my partner, understandably, I think. And my partner pushed the police officer, who was in his face, and then he was grabbed by 3 other police officers and dragged off to the corner. And then I grabbed my cowbell and rang it in their faces and screamed that what they were doing is not okay. So that happened. That was one interaction with a police officer at Billingsbridge.
So you've kind of left us hanging there. What happened to your partner?
He was surrounded by folks that we know, and he talked it out and expressed frustration and anger and disappointment at the way that he was treated and at the way I was treated. And we continued to participate in the day.
Was there ever, did it ever feel like the police were potentially considering charging him with something?
I don't think so.
No.
Nor did I follow up, or did we follow up about being shoved, me personally being shoved by a police officer.
Intimidated, though.
Well, what would you call a police officer pushing you away? That's what happened. Whatever that is, that's what happened to me.
Can I ask you why you didn't feel that you wanted to follow up on that? I mean, it's police violence.
I don't trust that anything would happen that would be helpful to me. I'm a busy person, frankly. There's a practical element of it. I spent my days after that on doing interviews and talking to people and debriefing. I also went dark over social media and put in protocols in place because I was worried personally about being attacked. I have a history of experiencing that over social media. And I did submit at one point, because an employer was encouraging me to do it, a police report. And in the process of doing so, felt scolded for having pictures of my children on social media and not being a responsible person for engaging in the sort of things I was engaging in, which were around climate advocacy. And I didn't feel like going through that again.
Just one clarification. You talked about the safety walk.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, so these were organized by a couple of city councillors and our MPP, the idea being to provide a safe space for residents to come out and walk. So I was on one of them. I'm not sure if you wanted to hear about sort of what I saw or the purpose
No,
of
about
it.
the idea, like about just the idea of, why people felt that it is necessary to have them.
Yeah, so I think folks were scared, and legitimately so, living downtown, of being harassed simply for walking around and having a mask on. And I think things like the safety walks were a way of, strength in numbers, of folks being able to go outside and take some of that space back. I think there was actually a really beautiful thing that happened during the convoy, which was neighbors coming together and supporting each other. I joined a Discord channel that was connecting folks. I need groceries, so it connected it to somebody who would go and pick up groceries and deliver them, or if folks needed their dog walked and didn't want to do that, would connect them to folks who would help walk their dogs. And I do think that is a really beautiful thing that came out of the disaster of the convoy, which was neighbors coming together to support each other and developing bigger bonds. And to me, that was the overriding thing I walked away from with what happened at Billings Bridge is when all hell breaks loose, you come together as a community, and that's where you can find safety. That's where we found safety. That's where we found action. It wasn't from our governments, and it wasn't from police.
Thank you.
That's powerfully and eloquently put, and I think in many respects that sense of community coming together and organizing is the same spirit that has led to the establishment of this process as well, recognizing that there's still something in the community that needs to be heard and dealt with. We could go on forever with you, Andrea. This was fascinating and captivating, really. It's been, I think, very helpful to hear about your particular role, but more widely the Battle of Billings Bridge, as history books will record it. But we are over time, so I think we need to wrap it up now. But thank you so much for coming and sharing this with us today. And I'm going to turn things to Monia to say a few words of wrap-up.
Well, this came to an end, and I would like to personally thank everybody who came today to testify and share their truth with us. I think it's not going to be only with us, but I hope when our report will come out, it's going to be with all Canadian and specifically with all the residents of Ottawa. I would like, of course, to thank my friend Alex for being, here together, and thank the staff and all the organizer and the volunteer of the Ottawa People's Commission. Without them, we wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't really be hearing all these stories. So thank you very, very much for allowing us to come to this room and bring together these stories. And the technicians and the interpreters very much appreciated your help, and everybody who made this session and those hearings available today. There will be other hearings in person and online, so please go and check the Ottawa People's Commission website, OPC-CPO, and keep following it and sharing it with your friends. We are always here available to hear from you, because as we said it from the beginning, unfortunately, we didn't see the citizen and the resident of Ottawa experience being somehow taken enough seriously, or at least, given a spot in the commission. So I think this will be a great opportunity for everyone to share with us their testimony. So once again, thank you, and thank you for everybody who attended, and with your present, either solidarity or even curiosity. I think we needed all that today. Thank you very much.